Only Jews can come up with this concept, right? They argue whether there's an argument or not. Arei shakoi. We already determined that the rule actually does exist, and since the rule actually does exist, proves that there's a fault in this very logic. Hi, this is Rabbi Shmuel Kopel. Nice to see you back. I put up a lot of videos recently about the tangents that I have in my Talmud class, which very often lead to very interesting conversations, and you're welcome to look at some of the other videos on this channel for those conversations. Many people ask me if I can make a short clip of some deep, intellectually stimulating discussions of the Talmud itself. Raw Talmudic discussions without any fluffy stuff on the side. I created this video itself where I'm going to go through two separate Talmudic discussions, each of which have very important lessons. I want you to try your best to follow along in each one of these discussions, and at the end of each of the discussion, I will briefly explain it if you had difficulty understanding it. I want to tell you that the second discussion is even more interesting than the first, and they're both very interesting discussions. And therefore, make sure to watch all the way till the end. I know you're probably thinking that I threw in the more interesting one at the end just to cheat you into watching the whole thing. That's not actually true. The second one is a little longer and a little bit more complex. So I figured let's start with a simpler one, and only after the simpler one, I'm going to get to the more complicated one. Okay, but they're both very interesting, complex, and deep discussions. So listen to the end for all the details. The very fact that the Gemara brings Rav Yosef in this embarrassing situation where he forgets everything because something very important is going to come out of this. What important is going to come out of this? We are going to pretend as if Rav Yosef actually said this. Then we're going to analyze what we can figure out from if Rav Yosef said this. And whatever we can figure out from if Rav Yosef said that is in fact going to be a legitimate analysis, even though we throw out his opinion for a different reason. We throw out his reasoning because it was a brisa that threw out his reasoning. Very nice. But the fact is that without that brisa, his reasoning stands, and whatever we can learn from his reasoning, we will keep and we will follow. Rabbi Yosef got thrown out from a brisa. Right? Now we say, Ulamai de salakadaitame koro, and this, that it came up in our mind to begin with. The Seif al Bati, that a Seif al Bati are equal. The Rav Nachman, and Rav Nachman says, Allah Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya, and Rav Nachman says the halach is like Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya, who prohibits whatever base Hillel seemed to allow. Elo Shabbos rechitz b'cham leiko. It seems to prove that there is no option to wash your hands in hot water on Shabbat. And in previous Gemara, we determined that we are allowed to wash our hands, feet, and face with warm water on Shabbat. Therefore, if we're allowed to do it, there has to be a possibility to do it. And the only possible way of doing it is to have boiling hot water from Friday into Shabbat, and then take this boiling hot water and mix it into cold water. Now, if you're going to tell me that there's no possible way to mix hot and cold water on Shabbat to make warm water comfortable for washing your hands, you're basically telling me that that rule doesn't exist. But we already determined that the rule actually does exist. And since the rule actually does exist, proves that there's a fault in this very logic. Now, to tell me that Rabbi Yosef didn't hear a brisa, fine. But to tell me that Rabbi Yosef has a flawed logic, we're not going to accept that. Because Rabbi Yosef was a brilliant sage. And therefore, he definitely did not make a simple logical mistake. Impossible. Didn't happen. So now the Gemara is going to figure out how do we justify this seeming logic mistake by Rav Yosef. You just heard this discussion and it might sound a bit gibberish to you, so I'm going to give you a brief explanation as to what just happened. Rav Yosef attempted to make an opinion, and that's actually what the Gemara says. He attempted to have a particular opinion. The actual opinion that he had was thrown out by the fact that it contradicted a brisa, and I'm not going to get into what that is if you don't know, but if he's not allowed to contradict a brisa, and if it is, his opinion is thrown out. However, The very fact that he tried to have the opinion, we have to find any aspect of his argument that was not thrown out and apply it to the Talmudic discussion. And the reason for this, as I explained, is that Rav Yosef is an accepted, brilliant master of the Talmud. And any brilliant master of the Talmud, we generally assume they don't make a mistake until we prove that they did. So even though his actual opinion was overthrown by a brisa, perhaps he forgot it. There was a time where he lost his memory. Perhaps he forgot the brisa. Perhaps he never saw the brisa. However, every detail that was not thrown out to the brisa must be applied to the Talmudic discussion, and that's what's going on here. There is a very important practical life lesson to learn from here. Very often, somebody gets proven wrong, and you say, okay, because you're proven wrong, let's not listen to you at all. Let's throw out everything that you've ever said because you made one mistake. Here, the Talmud is actually teaching us a very important lesson, especially when it comes to a master, but even when it comes to a regular individual. Just because you disproved one aspect of their argument doesn't prove that everything they said was false. Perhaps there is genius in the argument itself, and even though part of it got thrown out, but the other part should definitely be considered. And now we're going to go on to the next Talmudic discussion, which is a little longer and a little bit more complicated, but a very important life lesson as well. Mi savarta Rabbi Shimon aseifa koi, areisha koi. Do you think that Rabbi Shimon is referring to the seifa, which is the end, the latter? He's referring to the beginning, the earlier part. When we originally assumed that Rabbi Shimon prohibits, we assumed that he was referring to the bathtub. When Beis Hillel says that you can pour hot into cold, but not cold into hot, we thought that it was referring to the bathtub, that Rabbi Shimon says, no, in a bathtub you can't do it at all. But that's not true, says the Gemara. The Gemara says, don't think that it's going on the latter part, it's going on the early part, which is the cup. In the cup, where Beis Hillel says you can pour whichever way you want, over there, Rabbi Shimon says, no, you're not allowed to pour whichever way you want. You must also pour hot into cold and not cold into hot. Again, we originally thought that Rabbi Shimon was referring to the Seifa, which is the latter part, but really he was referring to the beginning part, the Reisha. And Beis Hillel allows you to put hot into cold or cold into hot. Rabbi Shimon ben Menasseh, he says, no, you cannot put cold into hot. Impossible. You're not allowed to do that. By switching it, now it makes sense. Okay, now it seems to make sense. Meaning, Rav Yosef's attempt of trying to compare a Seifel to an Ambati makes sense if we're going to change Rabbi Shimon. We originally thought Rabbi Shimon was talking about the latter part. Really, he's talking about the earlier part. Now it seems to make sense. Maybe. We're not sure yet. Okay? We're going to see the Gemara is going to try to attempt to throw that out as well, as we very often do. So we seem to have solved the issue. It's talking about the earlier part and not the latter part. There's only one problem with that, people. What's the problem? Who could figure out? What's the real problem? Let's go. Oh, we have a brilliant Talmudic scholar over here. Did you read further or you figured it out yourself?
I read a little further, but I didn't really know what they were talking about.
So you're saying you figured it out yourself?
They
Good for you.
Afterwards,
Huh?
kind of read ahead.
Okay, so if you look at the new way we just defined Rabbi Shimon's opinion, he's holding exactly like Beis Shammai. And two rabbis don't have the same opinion, or if they did, put it this way, if the Mishnah is mentioning two separate rabbis, each rabbi has a different opinion. If they would have the same opinion, we would say that these two rabbis had the same opinion. We wouldn't say one opinion, then go to another opinion, and go to a third opinion. If we're listing different opinions, it proves that they're all different opinions. So the fact that the Gemara is trying to suggest that Rabbi Shimon is holding like Beis Shammai makes no sense. Now, if it makes no sense, it actually challenges the very possibility that that's actually what Rabbi Shimon meant. Again, remember, initially we thought Rabbi Shimon was talking about the latter part of the discussion. We said, no, he's talking about the earlier part of the discussion. But if he's talking about the earlier part of the discussion, then it's redundant, because Beis Shammai already said that, right? Therefore, it would suggest, no, it's not the earlier, it's actually the latter part, which means we're back to square one. We need to try to figure out how is there something unique about Rabbi Shimon's opinion, because if we cannot figure out something unique about Rabbi Shimon's opinion, we will have to answer it that it is contradicting the way of Rav Yosef. So you're suggesting that Rabbi Shimon perhaps is more strict than Beis Shammai, that he doesn't allow even hot into cold.
Yeah, because that is the earliest part of the statement.
Okay, again, it's a good suggestion. It's a good suggestion. Let's see if the Gemara answers that. Now here is very interesting. What we're going to say right now is this is what's going on over here. This is what it's saying. Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel did not even argue about these things. In other words, Rabbi Shimon is actually arguing with the very earlier statement that there is an argument. Okay? These are only Jews can come up with this concept, right? They argue whether there's an argument or not. That's essentially what's going on here. There's an argument whether there's an argument. Now, in order to understand what this actually means, let me explain to you that the Mishnah, which is in the Tanaic era, is a compilation of teachings that happened throughout a few hundred years. That being said, very often there was an argument whether these statements were actually said or they weren't actually said. So take, for example, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. They were some of the earlier Tanaic sages. The people recording the Mishnah very often were recording these statements 200-300 years later. And therefore, there can be an argument whether or not they even had this discussion. And this actually is very common in the Mishnah and in the Gemara. Very often there's an argument whether there's an argument or not. And here Rabbi Shimon is basically saying that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel never had this discussion. Never happened. Here is actually a very important lesson that we learn in the Talmud. People always ask me, how do you take practical life lessons from the Talmud? Here is a practical life lesson in the Talmud, right? You read a newspaper, you read the media, and very often you assume that whatever they said is fact, right? That's the fact. Now somebody could come to you and maybe explain to you the facts in a different format, right? But very often, once you hear it as a fact, in your mind it's stuck as a fact. Same thing, when you read this quote, you're reading it, okay, here's the fact. Beis Shammai says this, Beis Shammai says this. You're missing another important fact. Beis Shammai didn't say this, and Beis Hillel didn't say that. Somebody said that Beis Shammai said this, and Beis Hillel said this, right? And that somebody might be wrong. The same thing today when you see media, mass media, or not mass media, whatever you're going to see, very often they are wrong. Very often they say what they call in America today fake news. They say fake news. You ever heard of they? They say a lot of things, right? And you know what? They're wrong sometimes too.
Most of the time they're the exact opposite of what ends up being true. It's not just that they're wrong, it's that they're perfectly anti-true from the very beginning.
Somebody said we have a good comment from, what's this guy's name? Darth Beer Jew?
Darth Bear Jew.
666. Uh-oh. We're messing with that. He says, this Talmudic ritual doesn't seem that scary. Why don't you come here and try it in live and then see how scary it is? Thanks for watching to the end. I'm telling you that I do appreciate the fact that you made it to the end of this video, and every time that you get to the end of my video, I want to thank you for that. There's a lot of competition on YouTube. It's not easy to keep your attention for this long, and the fact that you did, I totally appreciate it. I want to personally thank you for doing that. I also want to suggest that perhaps you'd be interested in helping these ideas get to the masses. There's one simple way of doing it is constantly sharing these videos. Another way is by subscribing and hitting the bell, because the more subscribers we have, the more YouTube will put our content out there. Another way that you can support us is in the description below. You will see that there's a link to what's called Patreon. Patreon is a website where you can leave a monthly donation. It could be small, big, whatever it is. And this actually helps us produce these videos. There is time, effort, and resources put into each one of these videos, even though at this point of time they're pretty amateur and we're not putting as much effort and resources as we should. But of course, the more support we have, the better these videos are going to get. We'll have the necessary resources to enhance these videos to a much higher level. Thank you for joining us. See you next time. This is Rabbi Shmuel Koppel.